The digital clock on the bank's window showed 6:47 p.m., and Maya felt every minute of her 12-hour shift weighing down on her shoulders. Her feet ached in her worn sneakers, and the smell of coffee and grease from the diner still clung to her uniform. All she wanted was to withdraw enough cash for groceries and maybe, if she was lucky, have a few dollars left over for that book she'd been eyeing at the used bookstore. The ATM line stretched longer than usual for a Tuesday evening. Maya counted 4 people ahead of her, each seeming to take their sweet time with their transactions. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, watching the businessman at the front fumble with his card for what felt like the 10th time. Behind him, a college student scrolled through her phone, completely oblivious to the world around her. Maya pulled out her own phone to check her account balance one more time. The numbers stared back at her like a harsh reality check, barely enough to cover rent, utilities, and groceries for the week. Her second job at the cleaning company started tomorrow morning at 5, which meant another early wake-up call and another day of rushing between work, sleep, and the tiny moments in between that she tried to call a life. A soft clattering sound behind her broke through her thoughts. She turned to see a man in his early 50s crouched down, gathering scattered credit cards and identification from the sidewalk. His hands were shaking slightly as he reached for a business card that had slid under a nearby trash can. "Let me help you with that," Maya said, bending down to retrieve the card. The man looked up at her with tired eyes that seemed to carry more weight than someone his age should bear. His gray hair was perfectly styled, but there was something disheveled about his overall appearance that didn't quite match his expensive-looking suit. The fabric was wrinkled in places, and his tie sat slightly crooked against his shirt. "Thank you so much," he said, his voice carrying a slight tremor. "I'm not usually this clumsy." Maya handed him the business card, noticing the thick, premium paper and embossed lettering. Robert Richardson, Chief Executive Officer, Richardson Technologies. Even in her exhausted state, she recognized the company name from news articles she'd skimmed during her breaks. They were one of those tech companies that seem to be everywhere these days. "No problem at all," she replied with a genuine smile. "We all have those days." Robert stood up slowly, clutching his cards tighter than necessary. Maya noticed he kept glancing at his phone, checking and rechecking the screen with the intensity of someone expecting urgent news. His jaw was clenched, and there was a nervous energy about him that seemed completely at odds with the confident executive image his business card suggested. The line moved forward by one person. Maya stepped closer to the ATM, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong with the man behind her. She'd seen that look before. The same expression her father had worn during those terrible months when the factory where he worked was laying people off. It was the look of someone fighting a battle that nobody else could see. Robert fumbled with his wallet again, and Maya caught a glimpse of multiple bank cards, all arranged with the kind of precision that spoke of someone who usually had their life perfectly organized. But his hands continued to shake as he sorted through them, and she noticed him checking his phone again. "Excuse me," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry to bother you, but would you happen to know if this ATM has been working properly today? I've heard some machines have been having connectivity issues." Maya turned around fully to face him. Up close, she could see the stress lines around his eyes and the way he kept swallowing hard, as if trying to keep something down. "I think it's been working fine. The person in front of me used it about 10 minutes ago without any problems." "Good, that's good," Robert replied. But his relief seemed fragile, as if he was afraid to trust it completely. Another person finished their transaction, and the line shuffled forward again. Maya was now second in line, close enough to hear the mechanical whirring of the ATM as the current user made their selections. The college student in front of her was finally putting her phone away, preparing for her turn. Maya glanced back at Robert again. He was staring at the ATM with an intensity that made her stomach twist with sympathy. Whatever he needed to do at that machine, it clearly meant everything to him. She thought about her own modest withdrawal, enough for groceries and maybe a cheap dinner tomorrow night. Nothing that couldn't wait another 10 minutes. The college student stepped up to the ATM, and Maya found herself making a decision that surprised even her. "Sir," she said, turning around to face Robert, "you look like you really need to use this machine. Would you like to go ahead of me?" Robert's eyes widened in shock. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly ask you to do that. You were here first." "You didn't ask. Maya replied with a gentle smile. "I'm offering. Besides, you look like you've had a rough day." For a moment, Robert just stared at her, and Maya worried she might have overstepped some boundary. Maybe he was the kind of person who would be offended by the suggestion that he needed help. But then his expression softened, and she saw something she hadn't expected. Gratitude mixed with what looked almost like relief, so profound it bordered on desperation. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion he was clearly trying to control. "I don't want to inconvenience you." "It's no inconvenience at all," Maya assured him. "Really?" The college student finished her transaction and walked away, counting her cash as she headed down the street. Maya stepped aside and gestured toward the ATM. "It's all yours," she said. Robert looked at her for a long moment, and Maya could see him struggling with words he couldn't seem to find. Finally, he managed a simple "thank you" that carried more weight than those two words usually held. As he approached the ATM, Maya noticed his hands were still shaking. He inserted his card with the careful precision of someone who couldn't afford for anything to go wrong. The machine's screen lit up, displaying the familiar menu options, and Robert began entering his PIN with the focus of someone whose entire world depended on what happened next. Maya stepped back to give him privacy, but she couldn't help noticing the tension in his shoulders and the way he seemed to hold his breath as he waited for the machine to respond. Whatever this transaction meant to him, it was clearly about much more than a simple cash withdrawal. Standing there in the warm evening air, watching a stranger navigate what was obviously a crisis she couldn't understand, Maya felt glad she'd made the choice to let him go first. Sometimes, she thought, the smallest gestures matter more than we realize. Robert's fingers trembled as he pressed the numbers on the ATM keypad. Each beep seemed to echo in his ears like a countdown timer. Behind him, he could feel Maya's presence, though she had stepped back respectfully to give him space. Her simple act of kindness had caught him completely off guard. In the past 72 hours, kindness had become as rare as the money he desperately needed. The screen displayed his account options, and Robert scrolled down to the one he'd almost forgotten existed. The emergency savings account he'd opened 15 years ago, during a particularly paranoid phase about market crashes. He'd deposited money there monthly for 3 years, then completely forgotten about it when business started booming and money seemed unlimited. As the machine processed his request, Robert's mind drifted back to just 3 days ago, when his world had been completely different. He'd been sitting in his corner office on the 32nd floor, reviewing quarterly reports that showed Richardson Technologies was having its best year ever. The company he'd built from nothing in his garage 23 years ago was finally competing with the big players. They had contracts with major corporations, a team of brilliant engineers, and enough cash flow to expand into 3 new markets. Then his assistant had rushed into his office with a laptop, her face pale with panic. "Robert, you need to see this right now." The cyber attack had been sophisticated and brutal. Someone had infiltrated their systems and stolen not just data, but had planted malicious code that corrupted their entire database. 23 years of client information, proprietary software, financial records, everything was either stolen or destroyed. The hackers had left behind a simple message: your security was a joke. Within hours, their biggest client had called an emergency meeting. The attack had exposed sensitive information about their operations, and they were threatening a lawsuit that could destroy what remained of Richardson Technologies. Their legal team estimated the damages could reach $50 million, money that Robert's company simply didn't have, even with insurance. But the worst betrayal had come from someone he'd trusted completely. His business partner and childhood friend Alex had been slowly draining company accounts for months. When the cyber attack hit and Robert needed every available dollar for damage control, they discovered that Alex had transferred nearly $8 million to offshore accounts before disappearing entirely. The FBI was involved now, but the money was gone, probably forever. The ATM screen flickered and Robert held his breath. His reflection stared back at him from the black screen, a man who looked like he'd aged 10 years in 3 days. The expensive suit he wore was the same one he'd put on Monday morning when his biggest worry was choosing between 2 equally profitable business proposals. Now it felt like a costume from a life that no longer belonged to him. The balance appeared on the screen, and Robert's knees nearly buckled with relief. $3,200. It wasn't much compared to what he'd lost, but it was exactly what he needed for the most important thing in his life. His daughter Lily was 22 years old and fighting acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The aggressive treatment plan was working, but each chemotherapy session cost $2,800, with additional medications bringing the total to just over $3,000. His insurance had initially covered most of it, but when the company's assets were frozen pending the lawsuit investigation, the insurance payments had stopped processing. Lily had no idea about any of this. As far as she knew, her father was still the successful CEO who could handle anything. She was already dealing with hair loss, nausea, and the constant fear that came with cancer. The last thing Robert wanted was for her to worry about money on top of everything else. Robert pressed the withdrawal button for $3,000. The machine whirred and clicked, and he found himself praying to a God he hadn't spoken to in years. Lily's next treatment was scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. If this ATM was empty, if there was some technical problem, if anything went wrong, the money appeared in the slot, crisp $100 bills that represented hope in its most tangible form. Robert grabbed them with hands that shook with relief rather than fear for the first time in days. He quickly tucked the cash into his wallet, right next to the photo of Lily from her college graduation just last year. She'd been so proud, telling everyone that her father was her hero and that she wanted to run a company just like his someday. As Robert finished his transaction and retrieved his card, the weight of what had happened over the past few days crashed down on him all over again. Tomorrow he would take his daughter for her treatment, and she would never know how close they'd come to not being able to afford it. But what about next month? Or the month after that? His lawyers had been honest with him that morning. The lawsuit would likely force Richardson Technologies into bankruptcy. His personal assets were tied up in the company, and even if they weren't frozen, the legal fees alone would drain everything he had left. The house, the cars, the investment portfolio he'd built so carefully, it would all have to go. But standing there at the ATM, with Maya's unexpected kindness still warming something cold inside his chest, Robert felt the first tiny spark of hope he'd experienced since Monday. Maybe losing everything wasn't the end of the world. Maybe starting over at 52 wasn't impossible. Maybe there were still good people in the world who would help a stranger without expecting anything in return. He turned around to face Maya, who was checking her own phone but looked up with a gentle smile when she saw him approaching. Robert wanted to tell her everything, how her simple gesture had meant more to him than she could possibly understand, how it had reminded him that not everyone in the world was out to take advantage of others, how it had given him just enough faith in humanity to keep going for another day. But the words wouldn't come. How could he explain that a woman who clearly worked multiple jobs and counted her own dollars carefully had just helped save his daughter's life? How could he tell her that her kindness had been the first good thing to happen to him since his world imploded? Instead, he reached into his wallet and pulled out one of his business cards. The embossed letters seemed almost mocking now. Chief Executive Officer of a company that might not exist in a month. But it was all he had to give her, the only way he could think of to leave a door open between them. "Miss," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion he could no longer hide, "I can't tell you how much what you just did means to me. If you ever need anything, and I mean anything at all, please don't hesitate to call me." He pressed the card into her hand, noting how soft and worn it felt, the hands of someone who worked hard for everything she had. "You've just helped me more than you'll ever know." Maya looked down at the card, then back up at his face with concern in her eyes. "Are you okay? You look like you've been through something terrible." Robert nodded, not trusting himself to speak without breaking down completely. "I'll be fine. Thanks to you, I'll be fine." As he walked away from the ATM, heading toward his car in the parking garage, Robert clutched the cash in his pocket like a lifeline. Tomorrow he would take Lily for her treatment. Tonight he would figure out how to tell her that everything was about to change. But for this moment, walking through the warm evening air, he felt something he'd almost forgotten existed: gratitude. Maya stared at the business card in her hand, feeling the expensive paper between her fingers. The gold lettering caught the streetlight and she read the name again: Robert Richardson, Chief Executive Officer. She looked up to see him walking away, but something about his posture made her heart sink. His shoulders were hunched forward like he was carrying an invisible weight, and his expensive leather shoes shuffled against the concrete rather than clicking with the confidence she'd expect from someone with such an impressive title. "Wait!" she called out before she could stop herself. Robert paused and turned around slowly. In the glow of the street lamps, Maya could see that his eyes were red-rimmed and watery. This wasn't just stress or exhaustion. This was someone barely holding himself together. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked, taking a few steps toward him. "I mean, I don't want to intrude, but you look like you're going through something really difficult." Robert opened his mouth to give her the standard response that everything was fine, but the words wouldn't come. Maybe it was the genuine concern in her voice, or maybe it was because a complete stranger had just shown him more kindness than he'd received from people who'd known him for years. Whatever the reason, the careful walls he'd built around his emotions began to crumble. He started, then stopped. He took a shaky breath and tried again. "I just lost everything. My company, my money, everything I've worked for my whole life. And my daughter." His voice broke completely on those last two words. Maya felt her chest tighten with sympathy. She'd seen that look before. The same expression her neighbor had worn when her husband lost his job and they couldn't make rent. The same helpless panic that had filled her own mother's eyes during the months when the medical bills piled up faster than they could pay them. "Is she sick?" Maya asked quietly. Robert nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, embarrassed by his breakdown in front of someone he'd just met. "Cancer," he managed to whisper. "She needs treatment and He gestured helplessly toward the ATM. "That was my last account. The only money I have left in the world. $3,000 to cover her chemotherapy tomorrow." Maya's heart broke for this stranger who was clearly drowning in circumstances beyond his control. She thought about her own struggles. The double shifts, the careful budgeting, the constant worry about making ends meet. But at least she had her health and her mother was stable now. This man was watching his whole world collapse while trying to save his daughter's life. "I'm so sorry," she said, and meant it completely. "That's terrifying. But you got the money, right? She'll be able to have her treatment?" "Tomorrow, yes," Robert replied. "But next month?" "I have no idea. The insurance stopped paying when my company's assets got frozen. I don't even know if I'll have a job in 2 weeks." They stood there in the growing darkness, two strangers sharing a moment of raw honesty that neither had expected. Maya could hear the distant sounds of traffic and see people walking past them on the sidewalk, all going about their normal lives while Robert's world was falling apart right there on the street corner. "What kind of company did you run?" Maya asked, genuinely curious now. "Technology," Robert said with a bitter laugh. "I built it from nothing 23 years ago. We developed software for security systems, ironically enough. Then last Monday, someone hacked into our servers and stole everything. Our biggest client is suing us, and my business partner stole millions before disappearing. It's like watching a building collapse in slow motion." Maya shook her head in disbelief. "That's horrible. How can people do things like that? Don't they realize they're destroying real people's lives?" Something in her tone, the genuine outrage on his behalf, touched Robert more deeply than any sympathy he'd received from his lawyers or remaining employees. Here was someone who barely knew him, someone who clearly had her own financial struggles, and she was angry about the injustice he'd suffered. "I keep asking myself the same question," he admitted. 23 years of my life, hundreds of jobs for other people, millions of dollars in taxes paid to the community. And it can all disappear because of a few criminals who think other people's lives don't matter." Maya looked down at his business card again, then back up at his face. "You know what, though? The fact that you're here, fighting to pay for your daughter's treatment instead of giving up, that says everything about who you are. The people who did this to you, they're nothing compared to that." Robert felt tears threatening again, but this time Hey weren't just from despair. When was the last time someone had seen him as more than just a victim of circumstances? When had anyone looked at his situation and seen strength instead of failure? "She doesn't know," he said quietly, "about any of this. I haven't told her about the company or the money problems. She's already fighting for her life. I can't burden her with worrying about how we'll pay for it." "That's what good parents do," Maya replied. "My mom did the same thing when I was younger and she was struggling. Kids always figure it out eventually, but protecting them while you can, that's love." They were interrupted by another customer approaching the ATM, a middle-aged woman who glanced impatiently at them standing near the machine. Maya realized she still hadn't made her own withdrawal. "I should let you get home," Robert said, noticing the same thing. "And thank you again for letting me go first. You literally have no idea how much that meant." "Anyone would have done the same thing," Maya replied, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. "No, Robert said firmly. They really wouldn't have. I've learned a lot about people over the past few days, and most of them wouldn't have noticed I needed help, much less offered it. Maya stepped toward the ATM but turned back before inserting her card.
Can I ask you something?
Your daughter, what's her name? Lily, Robert said, and for the first time since Maya had met him, his face lit up with genuine warmth. She's 22, just graduated from college last year. She wants to run her own business someday, just like her old man. His smile faded slightly, though I'm not sure I'm the best example of business success anymore. Are you kidding? Maya said with conviction. You built a company from nothing and ran it successfully for over 20 years. One setback doesn't erase all of that. If anything, watching you handle this crisis with grace and dignity, that's the kind of example any daughter would be proud of. Robert stared at her in amazement. In less than 10 minutes, this young woman had shown him more compassion and restored more of his faith in himself than weeks of meetings with lawyers and accountants. He wanted to find some way to repay her kindness, but what could he offer when he had nothing left to give? I mean what I said on that card, he told her as she finally turned to the ATM. If you ever need anything, please call me. I may not have money right now, but I've got experience and connections, and I'll never forget what you did tonight. Maya smiled at him over her shoulder as she inserted her card. Just take care of Lily. That's all the thanks I need. As she began her transaction, Robert walked slowly toward the parking garage. For the first time in 3 days, he felt like maybe, just maybe, everything might work out somehow. He had enough money for tomorrow's treatment, and he'd been reminded that there were still good people in the world. Sometimes that was enough to keep going. 3 weeks had passed since that evening at the ATM, and Maya had thought about Robert several times. She'd kept his business card tucked in her wallet, sometimes pulling it out during her breaks and wondering how his daughter was doing. She hoped Lily's treatment had gone well, and that somehow Robert had found a way to manage his impossible situation. Maya's own life had settled back into its familiar rhythm of work, sleep, and the small moments of peace she carved out between shifts. The diner had been busier than usual, which meant better tips but longer hours. She'd been putting in 12-hour days 6 days a week, saving every penny she could toward the emergency fund she was slowly building. It was on a Thursday morning, during the brief hour between her night shift ending and her afternoon job starting, that her phone rang. Maya almost didn't answer. She was exhausted and had been looking forward to a quick nap before heading to the cleaning company. But something made her glance at the screen, and when she saw it was her mother calling, she picked up immediately. Maya, honey? Her mother's voice sounded strange, shaky in a way that made Maya's stomach drop. I'm at the hospital. I need you to come here when you can. The drive to City General Hospital was the longest 20 minutes of Maya's life. Her mother had always been strong, healthy, the kind of person who rarely even caught a cold. At 61, she still worked part-time at the library and volunteered at the local food bank. The idea of her being sick enough to need a hospital was something Maya had never really considered. She found her mother in the cardiac wing, sitting up in bed and looking smaller than Maya remembered. Dr. Martinez, a kind woman with gray hair and gentle eyes, was just finishing her explanation when Maya arrived. I'm sorry to repeat this, but I want to make sure you both understand, Dr. Martinez said, looking between Maya and her mother. The tests show a severe mitral valve issue that's been developing for months, possibly years. It's reached the point where surgery is no longer optional. It's necessary to save your life. Maya sank into the chair beside her mother's bed, her mind struggling to process the words. Surgery, life-threatening, necessary. The terms felt surreal, like they were talking about someone else's family. What kind of surgery? Maya managed to ask. Mitral valve repair, possibly replacement depending on what we find when we get in there, Dr. Martinez explained. It's a serious procedure, but the success rate is very good when we catch it at this stage. However, I won't lie to you. Without the surgery, your mother has maybe 6 months before her heart fails completely. Maya felt the blood drain from her face. 6 months. The words echoed in her head like a death sentence. When would you need to do it? Her mother asked, her voice steadier than Maya felt. As soon as possible. I'd like to schedule it for next week if we can arrange everything. After Dr. Martinez left, Maya and her mother sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, her mother reached over and took Maya's hand. Don't look so scared, sweetheart. People have this surgery all the time. I'm not scared, Maya lied, squeezing her mother's hand. I'm just processing everything. But she was terrified. Not just about the surgery itself, but about something Dr. Martinez had mentioned briefly. The cost. Maya's mother had basic insurance through the library, but heart surgery was expensive, and there would be gaps in coverage that could run into tens of thousands of dollars. Over the next 2 days, Maya made phone calls to insurance companies, financial aid offices, and anyone else who might be able to help. The numbers kept coming back the same. Even with insurance and the hospital's payment plan, they were looking at $85,000 out of pocket. It might as well have been $8 million. Maya had exactly $1,400 in her savings account. She looked into loans. But with her income from 2 part-time jobs, no bank would approve her for anything close to what she needed. She considered asking her few relatives for help, but her aunt in Phoenix was struggling with her own medical bills, and her cousin in Seattle had just lost his job. On Saturday night, after another 14-hour day trying to earn extra money, Maya sat at her small kitchen table staring at a pile of financial paperwork that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Her mother's surgery was scheduled for Wednesday, and Maya was no closer to finding a solution than she'd been when this nightmare started. That's when she remembered the business card. Maya pulled it out of her wallet and stared at it for the 10th time that week. Robert Richardson, Chief Executive Officer. He'd seemed so desperate that night at the ATM, so broken by his own circumstances, but he'd also said something that had stuck with her. If you ever need anything at all, please call me. Did he mean it? Could he even help if he wanted to? Maya remembered that he'd been facing bankruptcy, that his own company was collapsing, but something about the way he'd spoken, the genuine gratitude in his voice, made her think he'd try to help if he could. She stared at her phone for 20 minutes before finally dialing the number. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. Hello? Hi, Maya said, suddenly feeling foolish. This is Maya. We met at the ATM about 3 weeks ago. You gave me your card and said, Maya. Robert's voice immediately brightened. Of course I remember. How are you? Maya started, then stopped. How was she supposed to explain this? Actually, I'm not doing very well. I know this is going to sound crazy, but you said if I ever needed anything. What's wrong? Robert's tone became serious immediately. Maya told him everything. Her mother's diagnosis, the surgery, the impossible cost. She tried to keep her voice steady, but by the end she was crying quietly into the phone. I'm so sorry, she said. I know you have your own problems and I hate asking for help, but I didn't know who else to call. I keep thinking about that night and how you said, Maya. Robert interrupted gently. How much do you need? The question was so direct, so immediate that Maya was taken aback. $85,000, she whispered. But I know that's impossible. I just thought maybe you might know someone or have some advice. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Maya held her breath, wondering if she'd just ruined everything by asking for too much. Maya, Robert said finally, can you meet me tomorrow? There's something I need to tell you about that night at the ATM. Something I should have explained then. And yes, I'm going to help you with your mother's surgery. Robert, I can't ask you to... You're not asking, he said firmly. I'm offering. Just like you offered that night when you let me go ahead of you in line. Sometimes we help each other and sometimes we get helped. That's how the world is supposed to work. After they hung up, Maya sat staring at her phone in disbelief. She didn't understand how Robert could help when he'd lost everything, but something in his voice had sounded different, stronger, more confident than the broken man she'd met 3 weeks ago. Whatever had happened to him since that night. She was about to find out. Maya arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early, her nerves making it impossible to sit still at home. She'd chosen a corner table where they could talk privately, and now she found herself checking her phone every few seconds, wondering what Robert could possibly tell her that would change anything about her impossible situation. When Robert walked through the door, Maya almost didn't recognize him. Gone was the broken, desperate man from the ATM. He stood straighter. His eyes were clear and focused, and while he wore a simple button-down shirt instead of an expensive suit, he carried himself with quiet confidence. Maya, he said, sliding into the seat across from her with a genuine smile. Thank you for calling me. I've been hoping I'd hear from you. You have? Maya asked, confused. Why? Robert leaned forward, his expression becoming serious. Because I never got the chance to tell you the whole truth about that night. About what your kindness really meant. He paused, gathering his thoughts. You know I was desperate for money for Lily's treatment. What you don't know is that I was about 5 minutes away from giving up completely. Not just on the business or the money. On everything. Maya felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean? I mean, I'd been sitting in my car for 2 hours before I got in that ATM line, trying to work up the courage to go home and tell Lily that I couldn't pay for her treatment. That her father had failed her when she needed him most. Robert's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I'd convinced myself that she'd be better off without me. The weight of his words hit Maya like a physical blow. She'd had no idea that their brief encounter had meant so much more than just letting someone go ahead in line. But then this young woman, someone I'd never met, saw that I was struggling and chose to help me. Robert continued. No questions asked, no expectation of anything in return. Just pure human kindness. And it reminded me that there were still good people in the world. That maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. Maya wiped at her eyes, overwhelmed by the realization of how close she'd come to missing this moment entirely. I just saw someone who needed help. Exactly, Robert said. And that simple act saved more than just Lily's treatment money. It saved my life. He pulled out his phone and showed Maya a photo. A beautiful young woman with short curly hair and bright eyes, sitting in what looked like a doctor's office but smiling radiantly. This was taken last week, Robert said proudly. Lily finished her last round of chemotherapy. She's officially in remission. Maya gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. Oh my God, that's wonderful. How is she feeling? Incredible. Strong. Ready to take on the world. Robert's face glowed with pride and relief. But here's the thing. Her recovery gave me the strength to fight back against everything that had happened to my company. Over the next 20 minutes, Robert told Maya about the weeks following their encounter. How her kindness had motivated him to stop feeling sorry for himself and start fighting back. He'd contacted the FBI about his partner's embezzlement, worked with cybersecurity experts to track down the hackers, and most importantly, reached out to former clients who still believed in him. It turned out that losing everything wasn't the end, Robert explained. It was a chance to build something better. 3 of my former clients offered to invest in a new company. One, focused on helping small businesses protect themselves from the kind of attacks that destroyed my first company. Maya listened in amazement as Robert described Richardson Security Solutions. The company he'd started just 2 weeks after their ATM encounter. Instead of chasing big corporate contracts, they specialized in affordable cybersecurity for family-owned businesses and nonprofits. We're not making millions like before, Robert said, but we're profitable and more importantly, we're doing something that matters. Last month alone, we prevented cyber attacks on 12 small businesses that could have lost everything, just like I did. That's incredible, Maya said. But Robert, even if business is going well, $85,000 is still a huge amount of money. Robert smiled. And Maya saw something in his expression that reminded her of that first night. Not desperation this time, but the same intensity of purpose. Maya, what I haven't told you yet is that Lily and I talked about that night at the ATM. I told her about the woman who let me go ahead in line when I needed it most. And you know what she said? Maya shook her head. She said that when she got better, she wanted to find a way to help other people the way you helped us. So we started something together in a fund, specifically for families dealing with medical emergencies who can't afford treatment. Maya stared at him in disbelief. We've been putting aside money every month since I started the new company, Robert continued. Lily insists on contributing from her part-time job too. We've helped 7 families so far with everything from cancer treatments to emergency surgeries. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. This is a check for the full amount of your mother's surgery. But it's not from me. It's from the Lily Richardson Emergency Medical Fund. And you're not the only person who's going to benefit from your kindness that night. Maya opened the envelope with trembling hands. The check was real, made out for exactly $85,000. I can't accept this, she whispered, even as tears streamed down her face. Yes, you can, Robert said firmly, because this is what kindness looks like when it gets the chance to grow. You helped save my daughter's life, which gave me the strength to rebuild mine, which created the opportunity to help others, Which brings us to right now, saving your mother's life. Maya looked up at him through her tears.
How is this even real?
Because 3 weeks ago you chose to see a stranger's pain and respond with compassion, Robert replied. Everything that's happened since then, Lily's recovery, my new company, this fund we created, your mother getting the surgery she needs. It all started with you letting someone go ahead of you in line. They sat in silence for a moment, both overwhelmed by the magnitude of how one small gesture had rippled outward to touch so many lives. There's one more thing, Robert said softly. The fund needs someone to help coordinate it, someone who understands what it's like to be on both sides of needing help and being able to give it. The position comes with a good salary and full health benefits. Maya stared at him. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you a chance to make sure that what happened between us that night keeps happening for other people. To be part of something that turns moments of crisis into opportunities for hope. 6 months later, Maya sat in the same coffee shop, this time meeting with a single mother whose son needed surgery they couldn't afford. Her mother had made a full recovery and was back to volunteering at the food bank. Lily was cancer-free and had started college again. And the Lily Richardson Emergency Medical Fund had helped over 50 families across the city. As Maya handed the worried mother a check that would save her son's life, she thought about that evening at the ATM and how a simple choice to be kind had changed everything. She'd learned that kindness wasn't just about the moment you gave it. It was about all the moments that came after, rippling outward like waves on water, touching lives in ways you might never know. Sometimes the smallest gestures really do create the biggest changes. And sometimes when you help someone else, you end up saving yourself too.